Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video, and secondarily visiting my channel, or rather subsequently visiting my channel. This video is somewhat inspired in format or in ideation by Enid Patterson's video on ADHD objection handler, and this will be called Intelection objective handler. As in, I think that very really people have a very negative and assumptive relationship whenever they experience somebody who is interested in, I suppose, intellectually based topics and expositors and argumentatively based intellectual individuals. Now, it's to say this that IQ and the tendency to be an intellectual or the aspect of intellection are not synonymous, as people can just the tendency towards the phenomenon of intellection or intellectualism is just the tendency to enjoy problems, analyses, and really demonstration. And demonstration in the Greek and philosophical school of thought, as in showing or proving things by way of communicative format or iterative patterns or even rhetoric and persuasion. So those who are concerned with ideas and input and the way that things are arranged do not necessarily have to be individuals who have high IQs, but are individuals of certain personality dispositions. Though these things can be related to IQ, there are very really people with high IQ who are intellectually lazy per se, and their IQ is something that helps them in this sense. So they don't see the need or the necessity for it. Intellectualism or intellection can seem unnecessary to many people, as it tends to be the burrowing into concepts and ideas, and that's an enjoyment. Really, it's a thrill and a way of connectivity to the exploratory nature of people, and then the communicative aspect of people, as people who tend to enjoy intellection or people who are intellectuals will want to spend more of their time talking about the ideas and the things that they've been looking at or discussing or discovering with other people. And this can be indicative of NTs, NFs, SJs, as even SJs will have their, whether it's in terms of theology or whatever. So even Christians per se and monotheists, I noticed that there are differences in them, as in there's some that are intellectuals or enjoy the aspect of intellection, and anytime they want to discuss theology with me, they present the Bible and things within it in systematic formats and dogmatic structures, which is not a negative word, but as in this is what's consistent and this is what we can base our trains of thought on, in creating strict parameters in a discussion and things like that. And I even enjoy that with them, though I may not be a monotheist or anything like that. I enjoy experiencing other intellectuals. Now there's people out there that absolutely hate it and treat it as the road of perdition or the road of pretension and the display of arrogance, or just trying too hard, or just I find it funny, as in just being verbose or exaggerating things, as in one is trying to be smart or something like that. So this is one thing I would like to, first thing I would like to say, that there's a difference between erudition, and that is being highly educated, and being in the activity of intellection. Intellection is just the tendency to get into things and to want to burrow into something. It's just the separation of ideas and the looking of things and being somewhat skeptical towards what one hears, or just being curious about all the aspects of information that somebody receives. So for example, right now I'm reading The Fundamentals of the Metaphysics of Moral or Morality by Immanuel Kant, and there are several things that Kant says, as in natural understanding or natural law, or men who subject themselves towards reason do not find that it leads them to happiness but puts a greater load on them. I try to categorize these things as in Kant doesn't give Kant gives explanations but doesn't give arguments for what these things are or why he ascribes these things, and I start putting them into categories of social understanding or consensus knowledge, as Kant was an INTP, and so introverted sensing and phenomenological aspects matter to him, and he includes those in his argumentative structures. Also, just different, and it's the same thing on Kant was philosopher of natural law, as libertarians like Kantian ethics and the categorical imperative that Kant created and things like that. So I want to look at all these things, and it's not because I'm trying to be smart. It's not because that's the way that my mind goes. It's just the way that things go. I want to look at everything and see where it fits and how it fits in with what I already know, and how it fits in with what other people are saying, how it fits in with political history, economic history, philosophical history, scientific history, literary history, all these different things in terms of how it connects to other things. So there's just this idea of looking at things in their individual parts and pursuing things like that just off of the sheer curiosity and enjoyment of it. I'm not intellectual because I want anything. I guess the only thing I want is my own pleasure and enjoyment. And so the first handler to that is intellectualism starts from a place of pleasure. It doesn't start from a place of social efficacy, social esteem. It doesn't start from a place of outward orientation, though that there are many people who have the tendency to laud their education over other people and use it as a means of the means of climbing up social hierarchies, particularly ones that are predicated on the manipulation of abstractions and knowledge. Yeah, so people use it like that. But the overall assumptive nature that when somebody hears somebody say something of a conceptual or ideation or intellectual variety, the assumption that this person is just trying to be smart is ridiculous, because anybody who's really interested in intellection or finds themselves being an intellectual out of no prompting really, because nobody ever prompted me, nobody ever told me to pick up Kant, nobody ever told me to look up the things I look up, nobody ever told me to read these things. I go and make searches and I find these things and then I explore them. I have different reasons for where I get to places or why I'm looking at things. But, I mean, I could give a fuck if I was in school. I could care less what other people thought. There's a lot of reasons I don't do it, and there's much of the items that I find and the things I come up with that I'm never going to be able to share with other people, or I will share with other people and they're just not going to appreciate it. So I better be into intellection. I better be an intellectual for my own sake and it's my pure enjoyment, for there is a small minority in class of people that are ever going to appreciate it or ever really exalt me for it, and there's a very high risk, high reward relationship with creativity and intellectual breakthroughs, as in your ideas, even if you come up with something seminal, most people won't understand it nor accept it, so you'll be obscure in your time. Even if they do understand it and accept it, really, the idea that so for example, the geniuses that exist today are mostly within the fields of technology, astrophysics, cosmology, quantum mechanics, and physics per se, and various parts of literature and communicative art forms, and it's a very small portion of people. It's a very, very small percentage, and there's a very small minority of people that can actually understand what they come up with and how their insights push things forward. They're like there's a lot of intellectuals that I know about that the majority of the world doesn't know about. There are a lot of philosophers that are not considered in the Western canon per se that I know about. There's pre-Socratic philosophers that many people don't know about, that I know about and I find interesting, and I investigate and I look at and I appreciate what they did, because they may not have come up with something that the rest of the world has attached themselves to, but they have done something to move things forward. Or the way that evolutionary theory has been extrapolated and modified and expanded since the time of Darwin by very prominent thinkers that almost nobody knows about outside of the field of biology or science, really, or anybody who's just interested in intellectual activity and investigation. It's just that none of these things, the idea, it's like this: being a connoisseur of some variety and prizing something that is pretty arcane or esoteric, and then thinking that you can present that to a mass population and they would be able to appreciate it or understand it. This idea that there's a social component, per se, towards intellectualism, when most people hate people that are smarter than them, one, or just are put uneasy by it. The most extreme example is people hate them. And the most common example is people are typically just disturbed by it in some sense, or made uneasy, as in they don't know what this person's going to think. Maybe this person thinks that they're better than me, or they don't know really what to expect from this person. So it just, there's a sense of uncertainty in dealing with the person, and this is the general tendency of most people towards it, towards the intellectualism. And it's just that idea that people who are intellectuals care, per se, to be impressive, really, is false in so many ways. As in, the Greek state thought itself, it prized itself in philosophical inquiry and the structuring of knowledge and the understanding of true ethics and virtues and things like that. But when somebody like Socrates came around and started questioning people about it, even the people who were supposed to know, they killed him. Like, this idea that people do it to show off, per se, is ridiculous. As I'm not saying that there aren't people who do that, but the majority of people, if you're drawn to something like mathematics or science or computer technology or philosophy or psychology, and a lot of times I notice people who are drawn to any one of these things are drawn to other things of the same vein. If you truly are intellectually based, you don't do it for anyone else, and you don't do it for what you can present to people, because most people don't care, most people don't understand. It's like, why would you be a stamp collector, per se? And it's the same, it's very analogous to the stamp collecting and the terms of collecting really beautiful ideas or really pronounced ideas or seminal ideas, because that's what I see myself as sometimes, as a collector of things and an inspector of things, as I've called myself an epistemologist, and I continue to consider myself like that. Like, I collect and I examine knowledge structures. That's really what I do, and I create them. It's almost like being somebody who has an interest in cars. You know, people who don't care about cars, presenting that to other people or showing off cars, like, you don't show off cars unless at a car show. Like, when I get into, for example, when I get into arguments with people on forums and things like that, is that people misuse topics and people misuse ideas all the time. Or they have this short-sighted perspective. For example, people who like Jungian typology usually just exist in the world of Jungian typology. And the deepest that they go is in Jung's original works. Well, I've read Jung's original works, but I've read modern neuroscience, cognitive science, behavioral psychology, psychotherapy, depth psychology, Freud, Anna Freud, the Adler, Skinner, so many, the phenomenologists in Bonds, and Jordan B. Peterson's work, and Rex Young, and Scott Barry Kaufman, and Oliver Sacks, and just Piaget, and a lot of other people. Like, I don't stop at Jung. It's like an agratory kind of thing. It's like Jung was an amazing thinker, but he's one of many. He's one of many, and I don't stop at him. I read Shakespeare. I read Dostoevsky. for their psychological insights. Same thing about Nietzsche, as Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Shakespeare, and Ovid, and Plato, and others were a lot of the original psychologists, insofar as that they were in the minds of others and trying to display what it meant to be human. And literature, very really, because before there was Freud and before there was Jung, there was a school of philosophy and literature, and they built their concepts and their ideas off of those individuals. So it's really fun and interesting to look at those ideas. And it's like being a car junkie. I'm a junkie and a hobbyist insofar as being an intellectual. Intellection is a hobby and a mode of being at the same time. It's just an interest and a drive towards something. So the idea that it's somebody showing off is poorly put together and only applicable in certain instances, and therefore this general objection that people usually come up with is a red herring, or just a hasty generalization on a lot of parts. So that's objection 1. Objection 2 is the attempting, per se. Now, it's this, that oftentimes the tendency towards intellectualism and IQ are conflated, as in they're assumed to be the same things. As where I am a physics major and I take classes in computer programming and mathematics, and there's people I know that have high IQs in those classes that are very smart, but they're lazy as hell. They're intellectually lazy. They just are. It's like, just because you're and having high IQ doesn't mean you come with a set type of personality. It means that you have a certain pattern of development in your intellect, in your neurophrenology, and that can lead to certain things, as you have the capacity to be analytical and you tend to be less impulsive, but that doesn't stop you from impulsivity, and it does not reduce the chances of somebody being lazy, and the tendency to underachievement and the gifted population, and the tendency to perfectionism and laziness and neuroticism and so many other things. It's just like, and IQ is only one dimension of personality, and there's several dimensions of personality per se that shows the way that somebody displays themselves in terms of who they are and what you see. For example, in myself, I'm high in industriousness, I'm low in agreeableness, and I'm high in neuroticism, and moderate in neuroticism. So I get fairly anxious, so I don't like to be around people per se, and I don't know what to expect from people in a lot of ways. But I'm industrious as hell, as in I'm a workaholic, and I'm highly creative. I can't stop producing things, and I'll wither on the vine if I don't get to make creative work or do things like that. And so that's not really a factor of me being intelligent. That's just those are wholly other separate dimensions of personality, really, that create the phenomenon you see in per se in that. And then just the idea that, I've said this before, in terms of intellectualism, it's an embodied trait, to where it's postulated and demonstrated that IQ and genetics, where it's 50 to 80% of the picture. It's not the entirety of the picture, but it is somewhere roughly around 50 to 80% of the picture. And there's differences in IQs amongst racial populations per se. There's great variation amongst individuals, and so one should never assume that an individual of a certain ethnic group is deficient in any way per se, as it's irrational to deal with anyone not as an individual or in any individual basis. Really, there's nothing logically or rationally established about that. Rather, it is more a hasty generalization and a erroneous mechanism and reason brought by way, I think, of biological and evolutionary factors, but very really that IQ is something that's embodied, as in it's a genetic phenomenon that has very tentative epigenetic influence, as in there is the amazing factor of plasticity, but that is only a factor per se that influences um, uh, crystallized intelligence and not really fluid intelligence. And one can increase fluid intelligence by way of nutrition and training to a certain extent, to where you can increase somebody's IQ 2 to 3 points, 5 points at most, really, but you're not going to move fluid intelligence over the lifetime of the individual in any extreme way. And it's just like height and beauty. If you really want to change it, you got to do cosmetics in some way, as in trying to overcome the genetic markers in makeups per se. It's like if somebody doesn't have the most pleasing face, they can get plastic surgery, but that's not a display of their natural makeup, but really something by way of science and engineering. And it's it's an aspect of culture and our overcoming of biological things. But IQ is the same way. I don't have to try and be smart. It's like a tall person doesn't try to be tall. A beautiful person doesn't try to be beautiful. A curious person doesn't try to be curious. Things that are innate and have genetic um, underpinnings, they're not attempts. I don't have to attempt anything. I wasn't trying. It's just the way things seem to flow. And that's hard for a lot of people to deal with per se, as it would indicate that there's irreconcilable differences amongst people. But it's because it's socially pernicious and hard to deal with, but not really that it's really widely disputed in any biological sense or any psychometric sense, as in there's more evidence for these things than there are of a lot of other things in science. Like, there's very few theories in science that are as strongly substantiated as evolution, IQ, and various parts of physics. Like, they underpin a lot of things. The next objection handler is the tendency towards what people consider articulation, as in if anybody is judicious in their word choice per se, they are accused of having some sort of syndrome per se, or they're accused of so it's like this. When somebody, I can see this when somebody uses many synonyms per se, and I see this when I help people writing papers and things in tutoring sessions, that the collection of synonyms per se doesn't really mean a lot in the exposition of ideas. It doesn't necessarily elucidate or add anything to things. But knowing multiple ways, knowing multiple nouns, and knowing multiple ways to represent an idea, that's something very different. And being judicious in word selection, as in eliminating verbiage and inserting verbiage that takes care of trains of words, rather than using a whole lot of words, very really is not university student syndrome. It's not all these other syndromes that are associated with pseudo-intellectualism. Very really, that if you find anyone who is being trained to be a scientist, you're not going to write any paper really using a litany of words, especially using words that are unnecessary. I don't like unnecessary words, and I don't like ambiguous semantics. It's ambiguity. You will not find anything I write and find ambiguity in it. It is concise, and it is devoid of ambiguity. I will say explicitly this, and I will say explicitly that, with very tight semantic structures. And that's because I'm an INTP, very really. I know that that's something that's a bias in myself. But again, that's not something that's because I have a high IQ, or it's something because of personality, again, and has a tendency towards intellection, and has a tendency to be conflated per se with other things that are not justified. It's really, I just wish sometimes people would look at their objections, particularly when their objections are based on social ramifications, as in when you're accusing somebody of social crimes per se, or ethical or moral concerns that don't have a lot to do with the things that they're talking about, you should check the place that these things are coming from and ask how valid are they given the scope of your interaction with that individual and what you're talking about per se at the time of the discussion. It's just that there's a real anti-intellectualism in Western culture, and you find it in so many people. And as in summary level of analyses, just nothing is very well explicated in summary level of analyses. You should simplify things, and you should only include what's necessary, and that's it anytime you're arguing things, but that's really it. That is only a parameter and does not give reasonable expectation in the breadth and the depth of something given the subject and the topic at hand. Subject matter and topic are more of the determining variables in that function. Now really, I would say next thing is this. Well, I don't know if I want to include this. Let me think. Alright, so the fact that I'm argumentative, a lot of times people assume because I'm argumentative, I think I know something. And an INTP and an ENTP, or anybody who likes to argue, will gladly tell you it's not that they assume that they know. What they are interested in is seeing what you know and seeing what's going on with your chain of reasoning and thought. If there's anything that they can gain from it, and what they're quick to spot is errors per se. And it's not like we are more curious and interested in argumentation for the same reasons that people play chess. We like to be intellectually stimulated, and we're curious. It's interesting, and there's pleasure in debate. Argumentation, and because I'm argumentative, means I'm less agreeable in my personality. It doesn't mean I'm a know-it-all. I just don't tend to agree with people, and I tend to find it fun.